Welcome back to Thinking Tuesday. I hope you're enjoying these so far. Today I've got a quote that was posted along with a follow-up question that got my wheels turning. The quote is from Jack Kerouac, who admittedly I haven't really read much of. The quote says, "All our best men are laughed at in this nightmare land." I looked up the quote and there was more to it. Basically, a critique of how media, print, TV, movies, etc., reacts to people who are putting forth ideas that push the envelope or challenge narratives and the like. The follow-up question that was posted along with this quote was, when a society ridicules those for integrity or vision, what hidden fears or insecurities might such mockery reveal, and how does this collective dismissal of sincerity shape the moral climate in which future generations learn to define courage, worth, and greatness? Now, this quote from Kerouac was included in a book that was written between 1954 and 1965. It was a collection. So one way to ponder how this affects generations is to look at the generations that have come since then. That's one way. But here's two different ways that I was thinking about it. First one I'm going to call position A. This is what immediately came to mind for me. It might be that when a society systematically mocks its most principled voices, it reveals a collective discomfort with moral accountability, a defense mechanism against the uncomfortable mirror that genuine integrity holds up to compromise and complacency. Those who maintain ethical standards in corrupt environments become reminders of what others have surrendered, or worse yet, what they never attempted to achieve in the first place. It could stem from a fear that sincerity might actually matter, that there might be consequences for the moral shortcuts that so many have taken. Rather than confronting this possibility, it becomes easier to just dismiss the sincere as naive, impractical, self-righteous. The alternative might require somebody to acknowledge that courage was possible for them all along, making their accommodation with corruption feel like a choice, a bad choice, rather than like something inevitable. Also, when a society ridicules these moral actors, it kind of protects a system that rewards cynicism and punishes authenticity. This might be part of what has created such a toxic learning environment. Younger generations get the lesson that sincerity and idealism is weak and foolish, and success requires them to abandon their own principles. They learn to mock and shun their good impulses before someone else mocks them first. Courage then gets defined as the ability to navigate corruption skillfully rather than the strength to resist it. Worth starts to get measured by power over principle. When society elevates the cynical over the sincere, it breeds generations who mistake being jaded for being wise and mistake moral relativism with sophistication. The very qualities that a healthy society needs, integrity, vision, moral courage, become those least likely to be cultivated or recognized as such. And I thought some may see that differently. This is what I call position B. The skepticism towards society's, quote, best men, unquote, often reflects hard-earned wisdom rather than a moral cowardice. History is filled with charismatic leaders who claimed moral authority while leading societies into catastrophic situations. Wariness of those who position themselves as pillars of virtue could be a healthy response. Understanding the dangers that unchecked moral certainty may bring about. Many so-called visionaries have turned out to be hypocrites, hiding their personal failings behind public-facing righteousness, or really believers whose inflexible principles caused immense suffering when applied without regard to consequences. Society's mockery might actually serve as a check against moral authoritarianism, defending against a kind of tyranny of imposed moral virtue. What appears as cynicism might reflect a more nuanced understanding of human nature in social systems. Those who are marked as naive idealists sometimes fail to see the unintended consequences that make simple moral prescriptions inadequate in complex societies. This resistance might show some collective wisdom about the dangers of perfectionist thinking in an imperfect world. Then position A might push back on that kind of thinking with something like, if skepticism of moral leaders is truly about preventing authoritarianism, why has society often embraced actual authoritarians who make no pretense of virtue? Why are cynical strongmen types who openly flaunt corruption sometimes more popular than the principled reformers? This might suggest, instead of protecting ourselves from moral tyranny, that we're just protecting or justifying our comfort with existing injustices. When somebody says that the idealists fail to see the unintended consequences, could this just be a rationalization for inaction? How do you distinguish between legitimate complexity issues and a kind of complexity mongering that keeps anything meaningful from happening? If we mock those that refuse to accept the status quo, how do we ever break out of genuinely corrupt systems that perpetuate themselves by convincing people that reform and change is simply naivety? Position B. In regards to rewarding cynicism, could it be that what's being called cynicism is actually humility? The recognition that moral questions can be genuinely difficult, and those who claim easy answers are just selling their brand of morality? When we criticize accommodating corruption, could we also be asking people to be willing to sacrifice the welfare of their families for a certain vision of purity? When we speak of future generations learning the wrong lessons, do we fully ask ourselves, who gets to choose what the right lessons are? What makes one moral definition of greatness more valid than another? I ran these two positions into Claude, which I've been tweaking with recently, adding prompts and nudging it along the way. I got it to act as two people who come from each of these positions' point of view and to debate this topic. It went back and forth at length. And when I say at length, I mean at length. I got it to change their perspective from two people having a debate to two people having a good faith discussion, both of them seeking to understand both positions better. And then finally, after it went back and forth on that, which was really interesting, I asked it to pose 3 questions from each position's perspective. Here are those 6 questions that it came up with for your consideration. First, from position A. And mind you, this is after probably, 20 times as much dialogue as I fed into it. Easily. Anyway, position A, question 1. When we encounter someone whose moral convictions make us uncomfortable, how do we distinguish between our legitimate concern for their methods and our own illegitimate discomfort with their challenge to our own compromises? Is there a way to honestly assess whether our critique of their naivety comes from genuine wisdom or from our need to justify our own accommodation with injustice? Question 2. If we accept that moral progress has historically required people willing to be seen as unreasonable or extreme by their contemporaries, how do we cultivate a society that can nurture such courage without becoming tyrannical? What would it look like to honor principled dissent while maintaining democratic humility? Question 3. When future generations look back at our current moral landscape, what will they see as our most glaring blind spots? And are we currently dismissing as idealistic the very people who see those blind spots most clearly? And then position B, ask these 3 questions. How do we differentiate between moral conviction that emerges from genuine wrestling with complexity and moral conviction that simply refuses to acknowledge that complexity exists? What are the signs that someone's principles have hardened into ideology versus remaining open to refinement through experience and dialogue? Question 2. Given that both moral certainty and moral relativism can be used to justify terrible things, what does healthy moral reasoning look like in practice? How do we maintain strong enough convictions to act decisively while remaining humble enough to course correct when we're wrong? Question 3. If society's mockery of moral seriousness sometimes protects us from authoritarianism, but also sometimes protects unjust systems from reform, how do we learn to distinguish between these causes in real time? What kinds of questions should we ask ourselves when we feel the urge to dismiss someone's claims as unrealistic or self-righteous? I found it interesting how Claude said some things that totally resonated with me. It said some things that I completely disagreed with, and it said some things that genuinely challenged me. I found it very interesting. I hope you found this interesting as well. You may have your own opinions to the original quote/question that started this, but I do hope you dig deeper into your own reasoning and the opinions of others as you seek to understand this or any idea or question better. Feel free to chime in on this. These last 6 questions could be a nice way to dive in. And as always, thanks for watching. Think about it.